to politics in the pub, which has always got a sort of crystal ball that somehow chooses topics that are pertinent. Some of you may think that just listening to the news tonight, the headline news, that it's George Brandeis joining a men's-only club to show how abreast our leaders are with current events. It's actually not that. It's about the terrible dilemma of Syria and Iraq. If you read Bob Carr's diary, you see in a particular passage a reference to the fact that the International Crisis Group several years ago said that one of the worst consequences from the Syrian civil war would be a spillover into Iraq. But because it seems there is no such thing of thinking preventively about foreign policy, the great wisdom of the West was that we had to wait until some other crisis occurred before we took notice of this spillover. Maybe the Department of Foreign Affairs should consult more regularly with politics in the pub. Because tonight we've got two colleagues, Dr. Noah Bassil, Professor Ahmad Schboul, who are both well known to you, but familiar, very directly familiar, with the foggy myriad and the complexity of threatening events which we now know as Iraq, Syria.
Good evening, everyone. I'm standing on pretty strong shoulders after Ahmed's talk. Many of the things I'll refer to, he's given a solid explanation of, so if I do repeat some of the things he says, excuse me, but I think they're important, they require some emphasis. Now I want to begin with a joke of sorts, well not so much a joke, but anyway, something that I was told in the 1980s at the time of the Lebanese war, civil war some people call it, but I think that's too simplified a description of what were very complicated events. Now I'll give the very brief version of this joke, and in the brief version, three people of different nationalities driving along go over a cliff in the car and perish, and they all find their way to the pearly gates. And this is a Maronite joke, by the way, so the reference is to St. Peter and so forth. And St. Peter says to each of them that they're allowed to ask God one question on entry into heaven. And they go in one by one, and someone of Lebanese nationality goes through, and he gets to God and he says, God greets, there's his greeting, and then God says, ask your question, and the Lebanese person says, can you explain the Lebanese war to me? At that point God looks at him, shakes his head or her head and says, not even God knows the answer to that question. And I think there's some truth to that, to the way that Syria has unfolded over the last 3 or 4 years, and also the events in Iraq. In a sense, we're talking about, I think, what are some murky issues, and to use a term used by Dick Cheney in 2005, we need to go into the dark side, or onto the dark side, to understand some of the events that are unfolding. Now, in presenting this sort of, it's not really an argument, just a set of sort of ideas, what I really want to do is destabilise or interrupt what I think are some of the master narratives that have formed about Syria, the Islamic State, for want of a better term, and Iraq. Now let me begin, or let me go on by saying that I'm no apologist for Bashar al-Assad. Unlike my esteemed colleague, happily see him removed from power, but again, this I think is an issue for the Syrian people, and not one that really I should have much say in. But the master narrative is that he is universally hated by the Syrian people. Now, I don't know if that's actually the case. I mean, certainly there's been a widespread uprising since 2011. There have been reports that as early as August of 2011, there had been an infiltration of foreign fighters into Iraq. So, and according to a report released by Mossad in January of 2012, they may outnumber the Syrians that are involved in the uprising. Now, again, these are just sort of snippets of information that have leaked out that might disrupt that narrative about the Syrian people universally hating the Assad regime. A study or a survey released by the Doha debates in 2012, after a survey undertaken by the Doha Institute, reported that 55% of Syrians, including a large proportion of Sunnis who were surveyed, supported the Assad regime. 30% didn't. Now, this was aired on Qatari TV. It was aired in Qatar, and Qatar are no friends of the Syrians. So again, here we're getting some interruption to this master narrative about al-Assad. An internal NATO report in early 2013 also suggested that maybe this master narrative is not quite as accurate as we've been led to believe. The report said that, and I don't know, being an internal report, we only really have the conclusions of it. We don't have the methodology, the number of people that were surveyed, the questions that were asked, etc. But the report concluded that the Sunnis have no love for Assad, but the great majority of the community is withdrawing from the revolt. What is left is the foreign fighters who are sponsored by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and they are seen by the Sunnis as far worse than Assad. Now again, the veracity of this is hard to pin down, but nonetheless, again, we're seeing some alternative information here about how widespread the revolt in Syria is. Now, what's also very interesting is very little of this, in fact almost none of it, has been picked up in the Western press or media. I've come across little bits. The Telegraph in 2012, this is not our Telegraph, but the little bit better version that the UK have, suggested that the Free Syrian Army was not as strong as otherwise had been thought, and in fact would be unlikely to overthrow Assad because few Sunnis were willing to join him. Again, this is just one report that's come through. Other than that, there's really been a very one-sided and often distorted picture in the international media. And in some way, it's hard to disagree with Chomsky and Herman's famous words that the media here appear to be manufacturing consent. Now, the question is, consent for what? And I guess in the context of today's events, again, very timely that we're speaking about it tonight, where US bombing of Syria has occurred, we might think that possibly this was the end game for the US and its allies. Interestingly, the US and its supporters at the Security Council have on numerous occasions attempted to get a resolution through that allowed them to create a no-fly zone or to disrupt Syrian airspace in aid of the so-called moderate, whatever that means. I guess that really just means pro-US elements in Syria. And they've been defeated by Russia and China on numerous occasions. However, as we stand here today, they've achieved that goal without a UN resolution. They are, in fact, able to conduct air sorties into Syria. Now, why? Why is Syria so important to the US and its Arab and European allies? Well, I mean, there is an element of the Syrian regime being one of the few countries and one of the few governments, the al-Bashar regime, that has not adopted the so-called package of liberalisation and good governance that has been overwhelmingly imposed across the world since the 1980s, and certainly since the end of the Cold War has become sort of almost universally accepted. When George Bush announced the axis of evil in 2002, he listed Iraq, Iran and North Korea, but a secondary list issued by the State Department included Cuba, Libya, Syria, Belarus, Burma, Zimbabwe and Venezuela. What do all these countries have in common? They are not open to US and global capital. Interestingly, when I said this to a class last year, one of the students said, yes, but they're all tyrannies, they're all dictatorships. Well, it's hard to disagree with that. But if George Bush's axis of evil was a list of tyrannies, we could add Egypt under Mubarak, Saudi Arabia under the House of Al-Saud, Equatorial Guinea under Basengo, Uzbekistan, Ethiopia and so on, all of them US client states. So this was not a list of dictatorships, this was a list of countries that were not in the US sphere of influence. Syria is also important because Assad is really Russia's only ally in the region. And Assad is also close to Iran. I think weakening Iran's influence is far more important, as Ahmad indicated, for US and Arab, and especially Arab allies, but destroying Russia's influence is far more important for US's NATO friends. Here I have a little quote from Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was the former director of the State Department's Policy and Planning section, a quite senior position in the administration, and also a former academic, what we call an organic one of the regime or of the administration. It's hard sometimes for me to call the US government and administration. But also now she's on the payroll of NATO, and she says the solution to the crisis in Ukraine lies in Syria. It is time for US President Barack Obama to demonstrate that he can order the offensive use of force in circumstances other than secret drone attacks, which are not really that secret anyway, or covert operations. The result of changing the leadership in Damascus will change the strategic calculus in Moscow, Beijing and elsewhere. Now this is Anne-Marie Slaughter's sort of take on Syria's importance for the US. So really, in a way, the events that have unfolded in Iraq in the last period is the consequence, intended or unintended, I'm not entirely sure, of US and US, European and Arab policy for Syria. So like Ahmed, the boundary between what is the Syrian crisis and what's the Iraqi crisis is in fact very blurred, to say the least. One could say, in other words, is ISIS and the instability in the Middle East can be traced to some murky stuff going on in the region. I would say the dark side that Cheney talked about a decade ago or so. And that dark side includes the US, of course, NATO, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and evidence suggests that the Jordanians are also playing some part. The Syrians, Iraqis and others, including foreign jihadists, are also involved. So this is not just some Western conspiracy. There is a far wider element to this that includes Arab and Syrian and Iraqi actors as well. And I don't want to depict this just as some sort of foreign conspiracy, but clearly that has an important dimension in understanding what is occurring in the region. So let me look at some evidence that might suggest this sort of dark side is being used to destabilise and achieve certain foreign policy goals in Syria. Now, Newsweek in 2010 reported that the Pentagon had been intensively debating an option that dates back to a still secret strategy in the Reagan administration's battle against leftist guerrilla insurgencies in El Salvador, which was led by John Negroponte, which is interesting because he became US ambassador to Iraq after the invasion of 2003. Now, this so-called model that the Pentagon was proposing would send special forces supported and possibly trained, supported and trained by the US, most likely hand-picked Iraqi squads to target Sunni insurgents and their sympathisers, even across the border into Syria. According to military insiders familiar with discussions, it was the most effective way of quelling the insurgency, and if Negroponte and others, in the view of Negroponte and others, it was a huge success in the eventual victory over leftist guerrillas in Latin America in the 1980s. Of course, the huge civilian death toll that accompanied this policy is completely erased from this scenario. Now, whether this would be a policy of assassination or so-called snatch operations, in which the targets are then sent to secret facilities for interrogation, was uncertain. And according to Newsweek, the current thinking is that while US Special Forces would lead operations in, say, Syria, activities in Iraq would be carried out by Iraqi paramilitaries. And this is information that came from officials within the US administration. So, you know, already we're seeing, already I can sense that there are some activities and some alliances that were being formed in Iraq in the latter part of the last decade that, let's say, were questionable in the least. According to a report released by a London-based research organisation, Conflict Armament Research, jihadists in Iraq and Syria had significant quantities of US-made small arms. The report said that many of the weapons were clearly marked as property of US government. Now, the narrative that we have is that ISIS has seized these weapons from vanquished foe in Iraq and Syria, but other reports suggest that there is likelihood that they were supplied by NATO and by Saudi Arabia, with some additional stocks being acquired from defeated Iraqi forces. Now, a report in the Daily Telegraph in March 2013 wrote that a Croat newspaper had reported 3,000 tonnes of weapons had been loaded onto planes at Zagreb airport and flown to Jordan, where they were delivered to anti-Assad forces in Syria. The article claims that the weapons were bought by the Saudis at the behest of the US and British governments. This was done despite the EU embargo on supplying arms to either the Syrian government or rebels. The report goes on to say that experts in Britain have identified in videos that they've watched that the arms being used by ISIS are indeed, that some of the arms being used by ISIS are indeed Yugoslav-made. So the idea that the West, or the narrative, is only supporting Syria's moderate opposition, I think can be doubted by some of the evidence and sort of following the trail of the weapons and so forth through the region. Now, according to New York Times article earlier this year, nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of. And this is followed up, or there's another article in a Lebanese newspaper, the Daily Star, that suggests that the Free Syrian Army is very, very weak and relies on the Nusra Front and ISIS in the fight against Assad. And a quote from Bassil Idris, the commander of the Free Syrian Army Aligned Rebel Brigade, and he says in the interview, "We are collaborating with the Islamic State and the Nusra Front by attacking the Syrian armies gathering in Kalamoon." He goes on to say that without their support, the Syrian army would make, he says, would defeat us quite easily. So we're getting here a sense that in fact this notion of the support for a moderate as opposed to as some sort of extremist element in Syria is probably not as clear as what is often made out. Now, the other narrative that dominates, and this is something that Ahmad alluded to or spoke about, is the one of sectarianism. Now, there's no doubt that sectarianism is an issue in the Syrian and Iraqi sort of conflicts at the moment, but rather than seeing it as the cause of the problem, I think we are much better off seeing it as a symptom. And it also has become such a master narrative that the only solutions that a lot of the intellectuals aligned to sort of the sort of think tanks and elsewhere are making is one about how to deal with the problem through the sectarian lens. In fact, sectarianism has become such a master narrative that, according to the Brookings Institute, or institution which we all know is quite a sort of significant institution in US sort of terms, that sectarianism, according to the report, is well on its way to displacing the broader conflict between Muslims and the West, and likely to supplant the Palestinian occupation as the central mobilising factor for Arab political life. Now, if sectarianism was the problem, as the Brookings Institution and others have said, then we would assume those countries with homogenous Sunni populations, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Yemen, Sudan, would be unified and supporting the Sunni cause elsewhere in the region. Yet this is far from the case, and Sunni on Sunni violence rivals that of Sunni and Shia, such as a conflict between ISIS and the Kurds, both Sunni, and if anyone's been following the news in Yemen and also in Libya of recent weeks, violence there is also on the increase. Well, maybe not on the increase in the Libyan case, but certainly has been constant for some time. So rather than seeing the conflicts in the Middle East through the lens of sectarianism or tribalism, which is some throwback to the colonial period, the sectarianism should be viewed as a vehicle for the struggle for power across the region. And at the centre of this struggle is Saudi Arabia. So here I'm echoing much of what Ahmad said in terms of the Saudi influence across the region. I would say it goes back even further than 1979 to the Saudi opposition to Pan-Arabism and Nasserism in the 1950s and 60s, and really Saudi influence expanded dramatically after the petrodollar started to flow in the 1970s. And their influence across the region clearly demonstrated in Afghanistan, but also elsewhere across the region. And one of the examples I have is of President Namiri in Sudan, a country I know quite well. Namiri came to power in 1969 in a coup. He saw himself as a Nasserist, much like Gaddafi did. He styled himself as a secular pan-Arab leader, but by the mid-1970s, he was already demonstrating an Islamist sort of dimension to his rule. And in 1978, in a famous moment, certainly in Sudan, a famous moment, he spectacularly poured bottles of alcohol into the Nile as an Islamic gesture. Now, it's no coincidence that Namiri did this at a time when Sudan was negotiating an extension of a loan with Saudi Arabia. Numeri's legacy, as it turned out, was that he was the president responsible for imposing Sharia law in Sudan. And one can track, I argue one can track Saudi influence in the region through Numeri's sort of turn from secularism to Islamism. And so, just to conclude, I follow through that Saudi role right through to more recent times, and I don't think we should negate or neglect this element of it when thinking about the events that are unfolding in Syria and Iraq. And I might leave it with that last point, and if people are interested, certainly we can expand on some of them during Q&A.